Today's episode of The Bluff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an notorious open source intelligent app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode.
Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And today we're joined by a phenomenal guest of ours, a friend of Artorias and a friend of SitRep and of The Bluff, Woofers. Woofers, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Please give an introduction of kind of what you focus on in coverage, because I think this is a very important topic in the last couple of weeks.
Hi, yeah. I did OSINT for Syria for a long time before shifting away and doing a lot of Africa work. But I've maintained a lot of my sources, especially in the northeast area of Syria. And in the last half year, I've started coming back and re-engaging with those sources, with OSINT, with just the general information space since the fall of the Assad regime.
Well, as you alluded to, well, first, I think this is the reason why we want to have it this episode is, we've had a lot of episodes covering Syria in the Bluff podcast. So for all our listeners, if you want to go back, we extensively covered, for example, the fall of Bashar al-Assad, some of the tensions, and in some of our global intel episodes, we kind of talked about it. But obviously, there has been a lot of developing situations specifically related to the Druze minority in Syria in the Sueda province. We're going to talk about the Israeli strikes against the Syrian transitional government, and kind of a lot of that in Syria and Israel's involvement. But I think it's important to highlight right before we started recording this episode, we got alert via the SitRep app that U.S. Special Envoy Tom Barak announces that there is a nationwide truce in Syria effective today, aiming to halt all hostilities and facilitate kind of a comprehensive peace treaty within all the factions and kind of establishing a national unity government. So, well, first, let me go to you before we kind of go into the specifics of this current crisis right now that's happened. Can you give our listeners that maybe not so in tune to Syria kind of what are the complex issues affecting the Syrian transitional government and the new president al-Shara ever since he assumed power and overthrew Bashar al-Assad? What are the issues that you're seeing? Is this a problem where maybe minorities within Syria are skeptical of the Syrian transitional government? Is this a possibility that there's maybe too many armed groups active and even within the majority held population? Because we've seen conflicts with the Alawites in the past, some with the Kurds, now with Druze. What are the broad-based issues that you think the new transitional government is facing right now?
I think it's really multifaceted. The crux of the issue here is that once Shar got into power, his idea was, okay, well, I need to have this centralized state. I need to consolidate power. I need to be able to have the state function. Meanwhile, you have all these minority groups, which comprise of course, the Druze, the Kurds, the Alawites, some like the Alawites who were previously in power, some like the Kurds who have now more power and were previously disenfranchised, and then the Druze who have traditionally kind of kept to themselves, but also maintain relations with the Assad regime and also have some historical links with the Israelis. Um, and a big concern, of course, of the minority groups is, okay, well, Shara might be saying that he's going to be a moderating figure, and he's taken some steps to move away from his Salafist jihadist past. But they look at the people who make up his government, who make up his ground forces, and a lot of these people are hardcore jihadists. They've been saying that party line for a decade now. They've been committing atrocities, just like everybody else did in the Syrian civil war, but specifically targeting certain minorities. So there's a lot of anxiety throughout a lot of these um, minority groups, well, throughout all minority groups, that a centralized government might be one that turns into a Sunni supremacist government. Um, something similar to what we might have seen back in Iraq when we saw Saddam overthrown, when we saw that sectarian violence as power started changing hands. There's similar fears that could happen in Syria, and a lot of these groups are now looking at what happened on the coast following an uprising by regime remnants, and then what happened in late April and early May in the Damascus suburbs with the Druze, and now what's happening in Sueda.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the episodes we've seen kind of this consistent issues within the Syrian government targeting and having conflicts with minorities. Obviously, we covered in a previous episode this whole situation in Latakia with the Alawites and kind of the remnants of the Assad regime. We even with the Kurds, and I think even in Aleppo with that Kurdish neighborhood within Aleppo still showing violence, and now kind of obviously the Druze. So, Woofers, what caused this latest round of violence that we've seen in the last week in Soweto? Like, what was the precipitating event? Who were the actors involved that really caused this issue to kind of escalate to the degree of violence that we saw? Because it was very intense fighting in Soweto that some estimates have hundreds of people were killed because of this latest rounds of violence. So, Wolfers, what is the reasoning, this latest tensions between the Druze and Sueda and the violence that precipitated it?
Right, so you have two main factions. You have these Druze militias, which we'll get into a little bit later. Then you have these Bedouin tribesmen, and this didn't just start a week ago. So you had beginning April, I think 28th, and ending on May 2nd. You had these intense clashes in the vicinity of Damascus around Jaramana, and a lot of that came from this assertion that, or accusation rather, that a Druze sheikh called Marwan Kiwan had made blasphemous comments about the Prophet Muhammad, and that resulted in widespread anger across the Sunni population, which ultimately, led to those clashes in the Damascus suburbs. Since that happened, there's been some constant back and forth fighting on the outskirts of the As government, including the As Damascus Road, which has been repeatedly targeted by unknown gunmen who are suspected to be Bedouin tribesmen. It's gotten to the point where at the beginning of the month, late last month, there were warnings against even using the road because people kept getting shot at. Road repairs couldn't be carried out. There was like an oil slick that was left unattended for multiple days. It was a severe hazard to drivers because people were too scared to go out there. And then finally, what happened on the 11th is a young Druze merchant who is selling fruits uh, was halted at a makeshift checkpoint, which was believed to be manned by Bedouin gunmen. He was kidnapped, robbed, beaten, and then ultimately released. In response to that, um, Druze fighters in As city specifically raided a an area that had Bedouin locals, and they kidnapped a bunch of them arbitrarily, saying, "Hey, like we want our guy back," even though he'd already been released. In response to that, the Bedouin kidnapped some Druze, and then in response to that, the Druze launched an attack to try and free their guys, and that's when it started devolving into just chaos. This was only made worse when, some security forces were sent down to solve the crisis, and whether intentionally or not, they were ambushed and wiped out. I think it was close to 2 dozen killed or captured from the security forces. Of course, at the same time, there was also some allegations that security forces were fighting alongside the Bedouin in the Asueda countryside, which I believe likely took place, even if it was just on an individual level, not on the authority of the state. But by that time, on the 13th, it was, full-scale conflict. Um, and mainly at that point, just people from the As-Suwaida Military Council fighting against these Bedouin fighters.
So, when looking at the security forces and Al-Shara, how much control does he have over those security forces? And do you think that they are strong enough to actually prop up this government?
So it depends on what he's trying to get them to do. So I think that there's different tiers of control that Shara has over these people. I think that the former HTS guys, especially those who are making up the Ministry of Interior and some of these more elite units, they have some pretty solid control over. But we also need to remember that most, if not all, the rebel factions, except for the ones who pledged allegiance to the SDF, of course, um, had declared their loyalty to Damascus, have been technically formally integrated, but uh, in reality, they just, they listen to their former commanders. So I point towards the SNA, for example, or I point towards the guys in Daraa, right? So they on paper are loyal to Damascus, and of course they'll heed their call um, if it's time to go to war, but they're ultimately loyal to their commander. If their commander says, "Okay, we're gonna assault this village," she says, "Okay, we're gonna do that." If their commander says, "Hey, I'm not gonna like lock you up if you you loot or rape or kill, or I don't really care, or these guys are all kuffar, you can do whatever you want." You know, we've seen after um the coast that there's yet to be any ramifications for these crimes. Um, I think, we're moving towards a point where I think that international partners are starting to realize that Syria needs a proper professional army and needs kind of a new army. And what ultimately that's going to require is a complex demobilization and then transition into a new military that just doesn't exist right now.
And so I guess my question would be then, so we saw fairly early on and in sort of the lead up to the ambush you were mentioning, having to pull security forces from elsewhere in the country. Do you think this uh, leads them exposed in those areas and potential destabilization? And then the follow-up to that, speaking of destabilization, do you think the strikes and the influence that Israel is projecting into Syria at this point is also detrimental to the establishment of this new government under al-Shara?
I don't think they were made vulnerable elsewhere. I mean, the Coastal Shield Brigade, that's the Alawite guys in Latakia and Tartus, uh, they're planning something for the future, I'm sure. But right now, at least as we're talking on July 20th, I don't see them as imminently launching an attack. The SDF, they do not have any aspirations to go on the offensive. I don't anticipate there's anyone eager to launch a coup right now. But I do think the biggest destabilization is, of course, um, to the SCG is these Israeli strikes because the Israelis have done is said, okay, we're not going to allow you to exercise the authority of the state, right? Whether that authority of the state be killing civilians or putting down revolts or anything, it's the Israelis say below Damascus, and that's in Arif Damash, that's in Daraa, that's in Aswada. It's like we will not allow you to have heavy weapons, and that allowed these Druze militias, primarily the Sueda Military Council, to fight back for much longer than was thought necessary, and even kind of embarrass the Syrian government on the 16th. And an embarrassment of the Syrian government and what any perceived humiliation, I think, is the biggest threat to the to Shara to um, this image that people have because people in Syria are looking for a strong leader.
So, first, I guess one of the things, I mean, and again, this isn't necessarily, I'm not trying to put you in the spot of trying to being an Israeli domestic political expert.
Oh boy.
I know this is, but I think it's important to highlight that even we early this morning, SITREP, we got the alert from Axios indicating that the Trump administration um, basically responded to Benjamin Netanyahu's strikes against in Syria because again, it's not only important. Like they targeted the military of the Syrian transitional government, and then they bombed the Ministry of Defense and
Right.
even the president, right, palace. in Damascus, but that the Trump administration, senior officials, multiple senior officials, basically said Benjamin Netanyahu is a madman. He's nuts. He's crazy. The madman, I think, is his exact quote. Some of these others are paraphrasing. But there's deep sense of frustration within the Trump administration, at least privately. We haven't seen this public from Trump yet, responding to the situation in Syria. And my question to you is, in your opinion, were the Israeli strikes against the Druze? Because the Israelis in the Axios report is saying, no, this was a military necessity because Israel believes they have an obligation to protect the Druze minority in Syria because of the significant amount of Druze population inside of Israel. So, I mean, my question to you is this a situation where the Israelis were seriously concerned about what was going on with the Druze because there were a lot of concerns about massacres, etc.? Or was this something that Benjamin Netanyahu did for political reasonings and more debate? Again, I'm not trying to put
Well,
you in
I
that
know I
spot,
think
but
I can be very explicit. I don't think that the Israelis were really protecting the Druze here. I think this is political. I mean, the Israelis intervened in force on the 16th. This was when the majority of Suaida city was captured already. There'd already been abuses, you know, there'd already been crimes. If the Israelis had wanted to prevent the Syrian government from entering the city, they could have done it, and they didn't do it. I think what they were being was very cynical, and they looked at the situation and said, okay, what's going to galvanize the Druze against the Syrian government, right? And that's gonna, this might be a little bit hot of a take, a little bit spicy, but what's happened over the past couple of days is Hikmet al-Hijri, this spiritual leader that a lot of the people in the Soweto Military Council listened to, even though that he wasn't their commander, he's now consolidated his position in Soweto because there's been all these crimes, all these atrocities, all these, that Israel could have stopped if they wanted to. So I think the sortie time from Israel behind the goal, and of course, to Sueda and then back in total is like 45 minutes. So you could have had round the clock bombing missions, and they didn't do that. I'm moving my hand, you can't see me, but they could have had round the clock bombing missions. They could have locked down everything, and they didn't do that. Instead, what they did is they humiliated the Syrian government and they forced them to withdraw with threats of wider strikes, I believe. And then, Hikmet al-Hijri was and the Soweto Military Council and then some other Druze militia who started joining them, took over the city again, and they started going into the countryside and they started expelling the Druze, not the Druze, sorry, the Bedouin civilians, which then, of course, triggered this tribal uprising or this tribal mobilization in response to these crimes and then other perceived crimes, which is a massive media campaign talking about, hundreds of executions and beheadings and people being thrown off rooftops. I think the Israelis made the situation worse for the Druze. I mean, the amount of crimes that we have seen over the past 2 days, I mean, the amount of property damage, the amount of civilians who've been killed by a vengeful Bedouin tribal men coming in, that, the Israelis, of course, have not bombed a single time, mind you, um, is way, way more dramatic than anything I think that the security forces would have done. I mean, the security forces, of course, have committed crimes and would have committed more crimes if they occupy the whole governorate, but it would have stopped. What we've seen in the last couple of days is, I mean, there's whole neighborhoods of Sueda that have, been burned down at this point. The security forces weren't doing that. That was ambly, but
no, 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 no.
but
It's all good. And keep
I think that this I don't know if the Israelis anticipated that the Druze would ethnically cleanse Bedouin. But when they did, they didn't lift a finger to help them.
so let me kind of, if I may zoom out just a little bit, though, right? And if we kind of look at the situation post Assad and the incoming now with the Trump administration, right? We have seen a very concerted effort of the Trump administration to be still kind of like Syria's, at least from the transitional government's perspective. I mean, I mean, obviously, still have Turkey has a lot of influence, the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. But you are seeing a concerted effort by the Trump administration to kind of get into serious negotiations with the new government. President Trump lifted all sanctions. There's a huge push to get a normalization treaty between Syria and Israel. There's even reports that maybe at the end of this year or after the UNGA, maybe Al Shara might go to Washington D.C. for more major announcements, diplomatic breakthroughs. But I guess my question is, I mean, are you surprised that the Trump administration has taken a very significant approach from a diplomatic sense, and specifically with the appointment of the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, also serving as a special envoy to Syria? You are seeing, at least in that area, and Marco Rubio do play a kind of a significant role in these new governments' incorporation back into the international community, and maybe even possibly a deal with Israel. Is that something shocking? And do you think this is something that could be successful, or there's too much and it's not bound to really have any major breakthroughs?
Well, I think that first off, parts of it are surprising to me because I think there's a significant wing in the Syrian, not the Syrian government, in the U.S. government. I look at people like Tulsi Gabbard, who now are finding out appears to have weakening influence in the Trump government. Who, Tulsi Gabbard was a big fan of Assad, and she was someone who was in a position to know all the crimes he was doing. Um, I mean, she went to visit. She went to Syria, I think, was it twice? She went at least once, but I thought that there would be. I was concerned that there would be a total disengagement from Syria and they would just not do anything at all. That was my big thing, and I think what we're looking at now is a period where the region's kind of figuring out what's up. I think the issue with the Israeli government is fundamentally number one, you have Netanyahu, who when Israel is at peace, Netanyahu goes to jail. Okay, let's make that clear. Netanyahu has a perverse incentive to keep Israel at war because he can keep delaying his corruption trial. Um, but also, I think that there's a fundamental disbelief in the sincerity of the STG by Israel. Israel, I think, at least there's certain people in the Israeli government who fundamentally believe that deep down the STG is secretly wanting to um, declare a caliphate, to cleanse the country of minorities, and then ultimately serve as a bulwark against Israel, and that's why they bombed all their stuff. The Israelis were not actually scared of Assad because they knew and they knew who Assad was. Assad was a known factor. They knew Assad wasn't going to kill himself going to war with Israel, and they probably had knew exactly where Assad was at all times. Uh, but now, I think that the Trump administration is also recognizing, okay, we have this person who's in power now. We have Ahmed al-Shara, and Ahmed al-Shara is he's a pragmatist, right? Um, he understands that he can't just go full jihadi. He understands that he has to have state institutions. He understands that he has to have a relationship with the West. Whether that's because he is sincere in those beliefs or not, I don't know. But the Americans have even said as much. Like they are worried that if he goes, whoever replaces him is going to be radical, and or the country falls into a prolonged civil war again, which would be even more bloody and more sectarian. So what we're seeing, ironically, a lot of what we're seeing right now, but at a national scale, is what they fear. Um, Recent events might be making people a little bit more anxious. I saw Laura Loomer, our favorite, commentator, starting to attack Tom Barak in the last couple hours for working with Shara, for setting up meetings between Trump and Shara. And now we've also seen Tom Barak, talking with the SDF in the last couple of days. We also have now statements from Marco Rubio, and I think that United States might be reassessing their strategy of potentially forcing the SDF into immediate integration. There was claims that they wanted them to do it as soon as next month, integrate into the government. I don't think that's going to happen at this point. But I do think we're going to start seeing things slow down um, as people start saying, okay, well, we need to see progress on discipline in the Syrian state. We need to see progress in talks with Israel, or we need to see just some form of minority protections in Syria.
So let me just pull that thread a little bit, if I may.
Yeah.
From your perspective, right? What is kind of the now in the post-Assad Syria? What is, for example, in your assessment, what is ISIS Syria? Are they gaining ground? Are they kind of staying put? Are they actually losing influence? I mean, obviously, OIR has expanded their area of operations to areas that
hmm
historically they couldn't operate because of Russia and Assad. The deconfliction line, that's gone. So now OIR basically has, for all intents and purposes, free reign. So what's ISIS doing? What's Al Qaeda doing specifically? Like, let's say, Khorasan al-Din. We still seeing U.S. conduct counterterrorism strikes and drone strikes in Syria, targeting these figures, even during the Trump administration. So ISIS, Khorasan al-Din, and then the last one would probably the most important one, also as you alluded to, is the Kurds. What are they saying? What are they doing? You already kind of alluded to it to a bit, but what is their perspective on Al Shara?
All right, so let's go through one by one. So the Islamic State, I think, are working to build cells in the cities of Western Syria. I believe that the Surah Ansar al-Sharia, no, as-Sunnah rather, so many names. So these are the guys who carried out that horrific church bombing in St. Elias Church in Damascus. I think those people are an Islamic State front, and that's not a unique assessment. A lot of people are of that same belief. And that, the whole idea there is they're trying to poach people from, HTS or these other Islamist groups who are now part of the security forces, but may be dissatisfied with the course of events, who might think that, the former Sheikh Jolani, who was basically an emir, um, they think that now he's a Western aligned statesman, so they're trying to gain fighters that way. They're trying to build cells. They might be trying to move in some foreigners again, who are out of the country, potentially from Africa. Um, I think they're going to be slowly rebuilding their forces. I think we'll see a slow trickle of attacks against government forces in the coming months, and then some terror attacks against civilians. But I don't assess that they're going to be taking territory anytime soon. Um, Al Qaeda. They still have a little bit of a presence in the northwest in Idlib and Aleppo. Uh, as we sort of mentioned, there have been some strikes against them in the past couple months by both the United States and the UK, which has been interesting. The British have been restarting some strikes. Um, I don't assess that they're going to be a major threat. I think that they were mostly just using Syria as like a financing hub, anyways. Um, and now moving on to the Kurds, there's a lot of Kurds, or a lot of people in the SDF at least, who are very, very anxious about the Syrian government, the new Syrian government. Um, I mean, the YPG, for example, YPG, YPJ has a long history of fighting against people who went on to join the Syrian government. We can look back to the Ras Al Ain, that's Serikaniye for Kurds. The clashes there in 2012, 2013. Those are three-way clashes between the YPG, the SAA, that was the Syrian government at the time, and of course Jabhat al-Nusra, which ultimately became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which of course Shara was the leader of throughout that whole period. So there's a lot of concern, like, hey, okay, well, we fought these people in the past. We know who these people are. Um, of course, it's been 12 years, 13 years since the last time they were fighting with these people. And ideologies shift. I mean, there was a whole giant war between Jabhat al-Nusra and Islamic State starting in, I think it was late 2013, early 2014, and that was a brutal fight. Um, and I think the biggest hold up to Kurds being able to feel like they can integrate into the new government is they look at the people who are now in the government, and they look at what they've done to the people. who have not joined the government. So you had these SNA war criminals. I'm talking about like Abu Amsha, Sheikh Abu Bakr, Saif Abu Bakr rather, people who were sanctioned by the United States for horrific war crimes and continued abuses, specifically against Kurdish civilians. They're now generals in the new Syrian Arab army. They look at the abuses that we're seeing on the coast. They look at the abuses that have been seen in now Asuena, and they see all these killings throughout the whole country targeting former regime members. So there's concerns that could happen to former YPG members. And of course, also the statements that people are making about women, the way that women are talked about by a lot of these fighters is super anxiety inducing for the YPJ. I think, in my opinion, the YPJ are the people who are most reluctant to lay down their arms, specifically because they have fears about how they will be treated in the aftermath of any agreement.
No, that I think that's a phenomenal point, and I think that kind of just puts the complex issue of Syria. And I think you've alluded to a very specific problem set for al-Shara, which is he understands he needs a centralized government, but this is a war that has lasted, but now like 15 years.
Basically.
There is no central government in existence at this point. They're all different factions, different groups, and they all form their own different structures for local or regional aspects of the state within the country to form their own governance. And now it's this post-government structure of trying to reintegrate them into some sort of centralized government, however that may look like down the road. And I think that's the difficulty for Syria, right? I mean, that's what
Right.
Bashar al-Assad, I think that was the intent of Bashar al-Assad all the time, to kind of highlight that and cause basically a destruction of the Syrian state, to say he's the only one that can reconstruct it. And now al-Shara is running into that issue. But I mean, I think the interesting aspect is from, if you look at regionally, from outside of Syria, I think there's a consensus, right? There's a consensus in Turkey. There's a consensus with Syria. There's a consensus with Qatar. There's a consensus with the UAE. There's a consensus with the United States that there needs to be this, even within the European Union, of now reforming however a central government like look like. And I mean, Iran, for all intents and purposes, their proxies and their fighters have pulled out of Syria. They're not welcome in Syria. They're no longer
Right.
in Syria. I mean, Iran lost a key component of the axis of resistance. And as King Abdullah famously said years ago, the Shia Crescent, so they lost it, right? They have no power or influence really in Syria. The Russian presence in Syria, I think it's fair to say, is not important anymore. It used to be a major aspect of Russia's foreign power and geopolitical strength. They're not a predominant player anymore in Syria's internal and regional aspect and foreign policy. And you're seeing the West and the Arab countries and Turkey really try to pick up the pace and reestablish a Syrian central government. And they're the ones that are really pushing this from a diplomatic front. But I think the important aspect now, there is consensus. Unlike in the Syrian civil war, where you might have Syria, UAE, Qatar, Turkey, all playing different sides. It looks like to me, Woofers, and correct me if I'm wrong, that at least in those countries, there is a consensus of where Syria needs to go. It's just the difficulty of getting there.
Right. I think, and I do think that, for example, the SDF does want to be part of the Syrian state. We saw that even they had negotiations with the regime. This was back in 2018. Those didn't go anywhere because the Bashar al-Assad wouldn't even accept like giving language rights, for example. The Baathists, they're chauvinists. The chauvinists. They're ridiculous. And you've seen that Damascus has been more willing than the Assadists were to compromise with the SDF. They've talked about, okay, we will talk about language rights. We will talk about cultural rights. We're not gonna change anything before, there's any like proper settlement. But our hard line is we will not let you integrate as a bloc. And the SDF are terrified about that because they worry that as individuals, there could be repercussions. They worry about who comes in to their areas afterwards. But of course, Damascus, the concern of Damascus is if we leave this group as a bloc, that's a potential coup in our future, right? Or that's a potential revolt, or that's some other thing that could lead to conflict in the future. Um, but we need to find a way to get past this. My compromise would be to say, okay, we are going to create sort of. So what the SADIS solution was back in 2018 is they were going to make the SDF into a core, like the Russian Fifth Corps was in Dara. Um, so you could have the SDF remain as a military unit, but they couldn't. You might be able to say, okay, well, this is going to be limited to 10,000 soldiers, so we're going to keep you as a division. Everybody else can choose to join the police or be demobilized. And you could have a compromise there, but there's just so everybody agrees that, the SDF needs to join the state again, but everybody but the SDF. I think the French are also there with the SDF, but everybody also wants it done really quickly when this is something that's going to take at least another year before we can see any progression. I think what we saw in Sheikh Mahsud a couple of months ago proves that integration deals are possible and they work. Um, but we're talking about an area much larger than a neighborhood in Aleppo.
I, I, Matthew, please go ahead, and then I'll ask my question. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, of course. So one of my questions would be, so you mentioned al-Shara's Salafist past, and I was wondering if that gives him any level of influence or provides a buffer against some of these groups with that Salafist ideology, or does his new role sort of negate that any influence that he might have had?
I think it does. I mean, he still has a clout. We haven't seen like big defections. There's been some hardcore supporters on like Telegram who've gotten kind of mad at him. And of course, you're always going to have Islamist purity spiraling, right? That's the thing that happens in most ideologies, right? It's not just exclusive to Islamists, but there's always going to be like, oh, you're talking to women in public, or you are talking to the West, or you have permitted the Christians to continue consuming alcohol, or you've banned the proselytization of Islam in, non-Muslim areas. That's going to ruffle feathers, right? But despite and of course, that's what the Islamic State Front group is trying to poach people from, right? But I think, he still has clout because he's responded to these threats by minorities who happen to have been religious minorities. Um, he has he's overseen economic growth, and I think he's going to continue having a lot of leeway with people because over the next few years here, unless something dramatically changes, things are going to be visibly better under Shara than they were under Assad, right? You're going to see construction. You're going to see foreign goods. You're going to see inflation go down. You're going to see your bank account worth more. You're going to get paid better in general, right? So, you know, one if something like that wasn't present, I think that these groups would start getting more and more dissenters. But I think as we just saw, with the travel mobilization and then all these people pledging loyalty to Damascus, he still has widespread support. And even if there was a problem, the Syrian society, at least Sunni Syrian society, Sunni Arab Syrian society rather, would stand behind him. And certainly a lot of religious minorities would end up having to stand behind him too if, Islamic State came around and said, "Hey, yeah, we're gonna cut off all your heads."
So let me ask one specific group, just because I think from a geopolitical sense, at least one country is always very, very concerned of them. Much other, the Turkestan Islamic Party in Syria.
hmm
I did see reports that the TIP in Syria has agreed to be kind of the last I saw was going to be absorbed under kind of the new Syrian military, the new Syrian Arab Army.
hmm
What are their role? Are they a minor player, major player? Do you believe they're going to kind of toe the line and not kind of continue directing threats against China? What are their kind of role in this new Syrian transitional government?
Well, you should start viewing the TIP more as settlers at this point. Uh, a lot of them now, I mean, they've had kids for years now. A lot of these kids are like either 10 or 12, some of them. A lot of them moved their whole families over. They're mostly situated in Jisr as Sugar. That's going to be in the northwest of Syria, near the Turkish border. Um, Now they got integrated into the Syrian government. I forgot the division name off the top of my head. Um, and they're going to remain a military unit, right? But I think increasingly a lot of these people are going to start turning into, turning towards civilian roles. We've already seen some very funny videos of former TIP members opening businesses. Um, they're still in their full jihadist garb, but they're like selling cars now and stuff. I think that's what you're gonna see in the future. They could be a problem for like I don't know if Chinese businesses want to start opening, that could be a problem in the far future. Um, but I don't really anticipate any threat from them right now. They're not as big of a component as they used to be.
And so you had also talked about this ever-present threat of sectarian violence, and I think the United States learned several lessons in Iraq, but one of them, when looking at Al-Qaeda in Iraq under Zarqawi and the bombing of the mosque, that it was sectarian violence by design. And I wonder if you do you think there are organizations within Syria that would see that as beneficial, as something they might try and model their sort of resistance after.
Yeah,
You do?
yeah. I
Okay.
mean that is Islamic State's whole thing, for example. Um, there are people who are deeply upset that they did not get an Islamic State, right? So you have, to be clear, you have Islamic State supporters of the group, and then you have just in general Islamic State. Like we want a state ruled by Sharia, we want Islamic values and everything. So there's always going to be people like that, and always going to be people who want to instigate violence um, for their own means. The Islamic State, of course, the group is the biggest threat for that. Now we've seen like with the church bombing in Damascus, and then after that there were multiple threats to bomb other churches in the Hama governorate. Those thankfully did not materialize, but the goal there is to um, threaten Christians, make Christians scared, potentially make Christians take up arms. But I think that's a long-term goal for the Islamic State.
So to kind of wrap this episode up, well, first, I guess my final question to you then would be, I mean, what are you looking for in the next week to month in Syria? Do you think that this ceasefire negotiation between Israel, Syria, and then even which was one ceasefire, and then now this other ceasefire, which is more internal to Syria, are you looking at for it to hold? Do you think it's going to hold? Do you think there might be a black swan event that might change the situation in Syria? What are the things you're looking for, and where do you think this situation might lead to in the next couple of weeks to months?
I think in Esueda, the situation is going to slowly get better. I think we're going to see a little bit more clashes in the countryside, and then we're going to go back to where we were a couple of weeks ago, which just some harassment on the roads, deep sea tensions. I think things are gonna. I think we're gonna be in this state with Syria where it's lulls, and then something really important happens, and then it's lulls. Um, I don't anticipate anything dramatic in the next couple of weeks here. I think we're just gonna have um, what happened in Sueda peter out, and then um, pretty intensive negotiations or talks behind the scenes to try and normalize the situation um, with minorities and prevent this from happening in the future. Because I think a lot of people are worried um, because this is now the second time that large sectarian killings have taken place.
And I have to imagine that the United States, and with the precarious position that this puts them in between their alliance with Israel, but also their alliance with this nascent government or potential alliance with this nascent government in Syria, and their alliance with the GCC states, there's certainly going to be pressure from the United States not to escalate on the side of Israel. The problem being that right
Yes.
now they seem rather unpredictable,
Yes.
and they seem more than willing to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And I think that is going to cause a lot of people in Washington to be
I think they're getting
somewhat
really mad.
uneasy. Yeah,
I think they're getting really
exactly.
mad. I also think that you might start seeing people. I mean, I think the recent Laura Loomer push against Tom Barak is probably reflected reflecting certain feelings in Washington. I think Tom Barak is saying a lot of stuff in recent weeks that are grinding some gears, especially some Kurdish gears right now. So they might tell him like, "Hey, dude, calm down a little bit, or let's be careful with our language. We don't want to give this impression to Damascus that you guys can do whatever you want. And we also need to be careful with how the Israelis are acting. Um, but you might, well, you might see some interesting infighting behind the scenes uh, materialize out in public in the Trump administration, I think, with the pro-Israeli wing and then the people who want more stability with Syria kind of clashing.
And I think with Bibi, constantly looking for some of these distractions from some of his domestic issues, like the
Yes,
the charges of, fraud and bribery and betrayal of public trust, that he obviously want to keep a very close eye on him because he's going to be looking for some sort of outlet there. So we've got a lot of stuff to focus on over the course of the next few weeks. And as it develops, we'd love to have you back on as a guest,
sure.
continue this discussion in a few weeks.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, and we will talk to you soon.